I just say I would be a very bad businessman, almost All right. We were talking about the Middle Ages and the situation of the Jews in the Middle Ages. And I told you about a lot of this, I think Rudowski covers quite well. And in his first chapter here, which is the medieval Jewish community, terror and libel, the ghetto, all of that, he does really a good job with. He does a very good job with. So most of the points that you may want to get as background, you can pick up out of his material. So I think this idea that we had of taking the surrender and of the Jews in Titus's time, and then the Jews the rulers being considered heirs to Titus, is the key to understanding the situation of the Jews up till the Emancipation period. And you say, well, what is the Emancipation period? Well, to some extent, that's what we're going to be doing in this class, the Emancipation and following. So, up to the Emancipation. And it's not the emancipation of the slaves, if you want to call it, in the United States. This is the emancipation from the ghettos. But you have to some extent, understand how they got into the ghettos. Now, you know, the time of the Crusades was a really bad time, and the zeal and stuff that was developing in that period from the late 1000s to the 1200s, you know, that reflected itself in blood libel charges. So blood libel is that the Jews were not only responsible for killing Christ, but they were trying to torture Christ further by what they call desecration of the host. When the ideology developed that Christ's body was actually in the host, it was called transubstantiation. It was called. And I'm not a great expert on the history of the Middle Ages. Substantiation of the host. The host being the wafer that is given to people to consume in the Mass. So then the idea that the Jews would go and actually try to do things to the host, stick pins in it or that sort of thing. Yeah, it sounds absurd. It was rampant, and there were charges of this kind in 1171 in France and 1298. And then there was the idea, for instance, that when a Christian boy was found dead, like we have people who are found dead even today, some rapists or child molesters or others, whatever's going around, leave dumps a body somewhere or whatever. If it was found outside the ghetto around Easter time, then the Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use the blood to bake matzahs. You know, you say this couldn't be. Unfortunately, I'm giving you the worst examples, but yes, it was. And then, of course, one of the worst things was the Black Death from 1348 to 1351. And then the Jews were accused of trying to liquidate Christians in Europe through the Black Death and poisoning the wells, because they had no idea what had caused the Black Death, and they didn't understand that this was a simple matter of Pasteur or somebody finding how germs traveled to host animals and so on. But all those unknown things inspired terror in people. So you would have successive things of that kind. So in the, as I told you, things got tougher and tougher in the 1300 period. And for instance, in 1306, they were expelled from France. The Jews were officially expelled from France. I don't know what the reason was. But then they would be invited back for financial reasons. Different monarchs would feel they were useful in the manner that I told you before. But 1394 was the last expulsion from France. And England, the same thing kept on happening. You had, you had some times when the monarchs, for instance, felt that they had some need for Jewish money lending and things like that. But in England, the actual expulsion was 1290 from England. And in Germany, which had not coalesced as a nation yet, there were constant sort of movements out, in, and out, and in. So usually it had to do with bribing or paying for permission of residence. So you had to, it was a kind of indirect taxation that would occur. So I told you that somewhere along the way the Jews were displaced by the Lombards. And this happened around in the 13th, 14th century. Because what happened in Italy, Lombards, who are the Lombards? Who are the Lombards? Well, Italy has different districts, just like every other country does, but we're not used to them all. We know the area around Florence is called what? Tuscany. Anyway, the northern area around Milan is known as Lombardy. So the reason that northern Italy, the area around Milan and the other city to the west of Milan, what's it called, where the Winter Olympics were just held not long ago, just last year.
Torino?
Huh?
It starts with a T.
Yeah, it starts with a T.
Torino. It is Torino?
Torino, that's right. Turin. In Italy it's Turin. All that axis from Turin, Torino, to Milano, Milan is Lombardy. And those people got some dispensation from the popes to start charging usury, and therefore they could get into what was ultimately called banking. So ultimately the Jews were not needed in Western Europe anymore. Once the Italian groups had a special dispensation, then places like Paris or London or so on could. Now this is before the Reformation, you see. So we don't even have the Reformation in Europe occurring, and the various wars that followed the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation from the 1400s to the 1600s, that then gave rise to the Liberal Age. So you're in the period right before that. Yeah, what's your question?
Had there been a traditional ban on usury, so to speak?
Yeah, the whole time, yeah.
Among Christians?
Among Christians, but Jews were allowed to do that. Well, that's why, I don't want to say that Christians are good or bad on this issue. The point is that Christians are usually not very quick to part with money. They say Jews are stingy, but in fact, I don't think many Christians give up money very quickly either, because they've learned that, first of all, you're not allowed to lend money on interest, and they're not going to give money away to anyone. So I think over a long period of time, they too learn to be a little bit cold-hearted on this subject, except for charity. But I'm talking about, giving someone money and expecting it back. No. Because the only person who really gets any money back from people usually is the person who lends it on interest, or something like that, or pawnbrokers, or something like that. Yeah.
Were there any edicts prohibiting the borrowing of money?
Not if it wasn't from a fellow Christian, apparently. You'd have to look into this more carefully than I'm doing here. But it is a really interesting subject. It's called usury, and I think again, Rudowski covers it pretty superficially, but he does a fairly good job, and I'm basically drawing on him with what I'm talking about here, which is why I like the book, because I think he does a pretty good job in a short space of time. But it's a really interesting subject, so But that's a good question. Were they barred from, why didn't they stop them from, why didn't you stop the Johns from going to the prostitutes, if you want to call it that way? No, apparently there was no ban in that direction, only the ban in the other direction. And so, I mean, I don't think most Christian people you'll meet are very free with money. They're very, and that's why even today, when politicians want to go and get money, they often go to the Jewish community to, I don't say shake them down, but to get the money. It's a long tradition. I mean, it goes way, 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 way back. It goes back 1,000, 1,500 years for the permission to, allow them to stay in the country, and they thought that was a good source of revenue. So politicians, and so you always hear from people, oh, the American government is dominated by this, that, and the other thing, and the Zionists or whatever. I don't want to go into the kind of rumors that you hear. Sure, in a way, there's some weird truth to it, in the sense that people learned a long time ago that you could go to the Jewish community and expect a lot more outpouring than you could in most communities. And I think that's good or bad, however you see it. But I think it goes way back to this weird history that we're talking about. So again, the fact that they were serfs of the crown, or vassals of the king, as it were, they couldn't do these. They couldn't get into the guilds, where different craftsmen were all involved in a guild situation. We have it today. Plumbers' guilds, carpenters' guilds. I mean, it doesn't mean everyone who's in these fields are a certain, have a certain benefit, but we have Teamsters unions and things like that. The guilds in the Middle Ages were extremely strong, but certain groups were not able to participate in them. So then somewhere along the line, and again, I don't have all of the information down, the ghettos started to be instituted. Of course, the word ghetto comes from an area in Italy, near Venice. Now, whether that was the first so-called ghetto, I don't know. But after a while, whatever Jews there were, for instance, in 1300s you had it in Sicily, in 1100s you had it in Cologne, in 1400s in Frankfurt, places like that, 1496 Krakow, and by the 16th century everywhere. So Jews were confined to these small areas within a town with walls. They could expand vertically, but not horizontally. The area was fixed, so therefore the infant mortality became high. Epidemics were easily fostered, and for instance, marriages were often limited. Rudowski does a very good job on this. And this weird thing we don't even realize, they had to wear a yellow badge. This is which Hitler reinstituted in the 1930s. They had to, that was going on until the 1500s, 16th century. And a weird kind of hat, kind of a peaked hat and a badge and so on to identify them. That's what Hitler brought back and so on. They were from money lending before, they really started to be reduced to peddling and pawnbroking, as we said. And that's when Jews got into the tailoring trade, and I told you about the dry goods situation here in the United States, and after dry goods and peddling, department stores developed too. So that was something of what the effects of that were. So anyway, things started to turn around a little bit in the Reformation. So, for instance, weird as it may seem, Cromwell invited the Jews back to England in the 1600s. Because he felt that England, after 300 or 400 years without Jewish presence, had lacked a certain economic development that this brought. And the same thing happened in places like Denmark, but these were mainly now Protestant countries. Finally, you have the situation of the Schutzjude, The Schutzjude. And that literally means permitted Jew. The Jew who was permitted to reside in a country. And to be permitted, you had to pay a license fee of some kind. So you really had to get permission from the ruling authorities, and to do that, of course, there usually had to be a bribe of some kind. So this situation of the Schutzjude is the situation we get Mendelssohn in. And that leads us into someone like Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn's dates are 1729 to 1786. 1729 to 1786. And he was from somewhere further east in this Polish area that was ultimately referred to as the Pale of Settlement by the Russians and the Poles, but that was a later period it was called, but I will write that on the board for you. I mean, it really didn't have international borders that were so clearly defined. I'm sure that individual counts, nobles, and others felt there was a border there someplace between Poland and Germany, but there was no Germany yet. Germany didn't coalesce until Bismarck's time. You didn't have an actual country, Germany, that coalesced. You had places like Prussia, East Prussia. You know, again, you'd have to do the modern history of Europe to understand, you know, what you had at this time. So, even to speak of Germany, there are little principalities that didn't unify into a country until the 19th century. So finally unified. Maybe that was one of the problems in Germany, that it was such a recent creation. And that's our problem again that we're facing in the Middle East. These are such recent creations that the traditions of political tolerance and respect and institutions and so on didn't have time to develop on a comprehensive level, perhaps. That may be what triggered this horrendous reaction after World War I in Germany. All these are interesting theses to explore. I don't have the answer for what happened, but I think you don't get this happening in countries like England so much, or Italy, or France. Spain's another question, because Spain had a unique history of a weird kind. Muslim conquest, then a Spanish Reconquista that took 800 years. The Reconquista in Spain went on from 700 to 1400. And it was only completed in 1492 when Columbus set off for America. So, you know, Spain was a country in turmoil and in the process of becoming for, you know, 800 years. So then when all this Indian gold poured in and the conquistadors and all that, Lord knows what the mentality in Spain became, and I wouldn't even want to evaluate it. These countries have only become modern in the last century, actually, in the sense of joining modern Europe and wanting to be part of the common market and these kinds of things. I mean, just 40, 50 years ago, Spain was under a Franco dictatorship. So it's hard to evaluate these other countries. But England, France, Italy are very old sorts of countries with old traditions, whether they had monarchies or not. They had old traditions and respect for, you know, the community and the way to behave within the community. So the kind of thing you saw happen in Germany after World War I probably couldn't have happened in England in the same way. France had waves of things, you know, break over France. It might have if France had gone into a dictatorship or lost World War I. You never know what might have happened. But countries like, you say, well, Denmark, Holland, these other kinds of countries, they're reinforced by a kind of often a Protestant independent spirit sometimes. So they don't fall under the same general tradition that you have when countries dominated in more papal sense. So it's very difficult to evaluate how given countries are going to behave. But where the ghettos go, that had been actually instituted. I don't know which, I think it was one of the Lateran councils. I think it was in the 1200s period. And as I said, by the 1600s it was everywhere. So to leave the ghetto, you had to have permission. You had to go into the ghetto at night. You couldn't just be traveling on the roads. You know, you'd have to have a reason. So this shifts you to a situation where certain Jews were permitted to come west again. You say, where did all that population go? I covered it last time to a certain extent, but it's worth reviewing. Where did it all go? A lot of it, you know, just went into this no man's land area on the borderlands, the Netherlands, if you want to call it that, the area which hadn't coalesced yet into a European national entity. So that whole area from northern Poland down into Romania and the Carpathian Mountains and all of those areas there, and western Russia down to Kiev and the Ukraine, and then down into Odessa and those places. That's where the massive Jewish population ended up. Now, how much of it was already there? You know, where, I mean, was it already there, or did it come from Western immigration or Northern immigration? Some of it probably pushed up from the Byzantine Empire into the southern Crimea. There was a guy called Arthur Koestler, a very famous communist writer, intellectual of the mid-last century. To me, he's not the last century, he's a contemporary almost, but he wrote a book, forgetting what the name of it was, but his argument was that the Jews of Eastern Europe were largely the product of conversion of the Khazars, of the, what he called this tribe, the Khazars, which is where we get the term Hussar from. It's a nomadic people north of the Black Sea in the Crimean area eastwards. The Cossacks were down there, the Hussars, and there was a conversion that we know about that certain Jewish intellectuals write about in the Middle Ages. Maimonides is aware of it, but the most famous one who is aware of it is Judah, or in the Hebrew, Yehuda. Halevi. He wrote a book called the Kuzari. How many have heard of that book called the Kuzari? Which is the description of a Platonic type debate that the king of the Khazars invites the Jews, Christians, and Muslim leaders to have in his presence over which is the superior religion. And since Judah Halevi is a famous, he's in Spain, he lives near Toledo, this Spanish Jewish writer before the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in the 1490 period. The last expulsion was the Jews from Spain in 1492. That was the last expulsion. The Jews had been in Spain for, I said, pre-Roman times. And when Spain was reunified, the first thing the Spanish monarchy did was expel all Jews and Muslims. And and that's why they instituted the Inquisition. So they wanted to get people who had falsely converted as far as they were concerned, both Jews and Muslims, but I think primarily Jews, because most of the Muslims either left or converted. They didn't have fake conversions, as it was called, but the Jews, there were some, what was called Marana. I'm not often spelling this thing right. Probably it's like that. I don't know how to spell it anyway. Probably it's got two ends, but anyway. Fix my spelling from one of your indexes, but Maranos were fake converts who made believe they were Christian but kept Jewish tradition in private. You know, they've done DNA testing in Spain and comes out that sort of like, I don't know, something like 25% of the population is basically Jewish in Spain. It's just a huge amount still there within the if you want to speak of blood types or something.
They're Catholics now.
Oh yeah, Spain is Catholic since the Inquisition, and you wouldn't stand up to the Inquisition. I can assure you. You know, we have in northern Mexico and southern southwestern United, we have what are called conversos. How many have heard of them? They're Spanish Jews who came to Mexico and you know, Santa Fe area, and then they were called conversos, and then they wanted to more recently re-emerge as Jews in some way, but they remember their Jewish past, even though they're Catholic at the moment. There's a special name for them, conversos. What?
It's crypto Jews, right? Is that the same
Something
thing?
like that. You would call them crypto Jews.
But
they're not even, you know, it's not clear that they know what being a Jew is, but they have some customs that
Right.
remain even now, and many of them came to this area of the Southwest, northern Mexico and Southwest United States, New Mexico area, for some reason.
I thought I had heard or read that some of that had been kind of debunked a little bit.
Yeah, there may be some debunking, but there's a lot there too. Not all, obviously, anything is debunkable, but there's a lot there as well. I mean, so anyways, yeah, some people want to do it, some want to pretend they are too, because they feel rootless anyway, and they want to. But there is quite a lot of in Spain anyway. I mean, I think everyone admits it in Spain. You scratch anyone there, and there's a huge Jewish background somewhere. So anyway, the Inquisition was brought about to hunt these people down, and it's a pretty dreadful matter. I mean, I'm not, again, not an expert on it, but the worst part is that they exported it to the Americas and were, you know, applying it to Indians, which is really, I think, sick, frankly. You can't get any sicker than that. But who am I to judge other sicknesses? I just say, to me, that's totally sick. That was very recent, almost 1500. Then the final expulsions took place. We're just getting ready for the coming back in period when they're expelling people. Any case, so we're talking about Eastern Europe. Where the huge population pool, I don't think the Spanish population pool went to Eastern Europe. We know that the Spanish population pool, that's why all the Jews of North Africa now and the Middle East are called Sephardi. The reason that they're called Sephardi is Spain, Sepharad is the Jewish name for Spain. Sepharad. And so Sephardi is Jews of Spanish background. Now, someone from Yemen, and you know, Jews are very widespread. Ethiopia, Yemen, you'd be amazed. There's Jews in China, and there's groups in Japan that claim to be a descendant of Jews, and I think there are some indications that there are some who are, because the trade was very widespread. I mentioned that to you before, the silk trade and the East India Company was originally a Jewish company. The famous East India Company of the Netherlands. And then that's why Cromwell wanted to bring them back into England to get involved in the East India trade. And so he said, well, how come they were so good? Well, because they had congregants in all these different places. You didn't need to go there with any money. You could just sign a chit, an IOU or something like that. You could go to like India and there'd be some Jewish community there, and they would recognize your status or whatever. I mean, that gave them a tremendous advantage. Yes, it certainly did. You know, they didn't need to have pay people salaries, have banking institutions in Macau or someplace. They already had some people out there, and a lot of this is documented in the very famous collection I mentioned before. I'll mention again. Sorry to jump around, but there's such a vast background here, you know. The Cairo gets to be appreciated. The Cairo Geniza, I told you about, that's where some Dead Sea Scrolls were found, before the scrolls were discovered. We still use the document of Dead Sea Scrolls that was found there called the Cairo-Damascus document, because it's the most complete version of this document. We found it in the Dead Sea area, about 12 or 10 or 7, I don't know how many different copies of it in different handwriting, but not complete. But in the Cairo Geniza we have 2 variant, but one complete and one a different version. 2 texts of it there. How did it get there? Because some people hadn't got it out of the caves earlier and never put it in the caves. And it then ended up in, but also in the Cairo Geniza, which a Geniza is a place where you bury old documents that have the name of God usually in them, because you're not allowed to destroy them. But in there you also throw all the old documents, prayer books, letters, everything, marriage licenses. So it turned out in this Geniza there was material from the whole Mediterranean trade situation of the 10, 11, and 1200s. And there was all, you know, behind this wall that they uncovered, there were letters from India and places like that, and correspondence across the Mediterranean and so on. So it became a total picture of mercantile trade in the Middle Ages in the Mediterranean. This is really interesting. And the few Dead Sea Scroll documents were a minor interest to most people. It was a sociological view of Europe that they provided. And you know, they actually had a document there, a letter from the Khuzar king to someone in Egypt discussing this conversion of the Khazars. So in the Cairo Geniza there is a letter about that from the Middle Ages. So anyway, this Koestler, Arthur Koestler, he wrote a book, I forget what it was called, claiming, I guess it was the 13th tribe, I think that's what he called it, claiming that the Jews were really that's why they had this huge population in Russia. They were Khazars. There's some Khazar blood, obviously, among Jews, which is a kind of Turkish, Russo-Turkish people of the steppes. There's obviously perhaps some of that blood. The Arabs want to say it's all, that's all who the Jews are, so they should go back to Russia, and so on. But I don't think that that's the majority, or even close to the majority. You know, I think that I don't want to be a racist, but the racial stereotypes and different things, DNA would do a lot of verifying different things. But I think you'll find that there's a pretty deep consistency, regardless of the different types that have emerged. Yemeni Jews, you know, there's Jewish tribes in Nigeria. You know, there's, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you Ethiopia and so on, where all these people got to. Very, very persistent situation. And the DNA often holds up. Many of them carry priestly markers from the Second Temple period. The ones in Nigeria, turned out, were carrying the priestly marker, even though they're totally black now. You say, well, how come? Well, once you start intermarrying with the local people, and then that takes over, that strain becomes the dominant strain, so basically you look like the people you're living with. Same with Yemen, same in many other places. But if you go deeper down into the DNA structure, you find these markers. This is a very, very odd thing, you know. So again, I'm not trying to give racial theory here, but I'm just trying to show you that you know, these things are not just made up. Like, there may be some, but a lot of it is verifiable. Yeah.
How far back can they go genetically?
I'm not a DNA expert, but I think that the African situation probably goes back to the destruction of the first temple situation. When tribes went down into Egypt, different groups went down into Egypt. We know there was a Jewish garrison in southern Egypt, At Elephantina it was called, the border with the Sudan. There was a temple there. That's how that so-called treasured ended up in Ethiopia. The Holy of Holies or whatever, you know, Steven Spielberg, what's that movie? The Ark of the Covenant supposedly is in this town in Ethiopia. Yeah, the traditions went down there, whether they have a copy or the Ark of the Covenant from the temple in Egypt or whatever that is down there, something got down there or was copied or whatever. And of course, there are all the traditions of Solomon and Sheba, though she was a Southern Arabian queen, not an Ethiopian queen. But anyway, then it probably went down further. I haven't done there've been some really good programs on the Discovery Channel, in other words, going down into Kenya, different forts that were built there, and then down into Nigeria. I don't think it was after the Roman conquest as much as maybe earlier that these people started going down into those areas. I know, for instance, that the tradition of the Jews of Cochin, which is on the western shore of India, in the Malabar coast, where all of the ginger comes from. All the ginger that you see in the Japanese restaurants and so on all comes from the Malabar coast and so on. They were in the spice trade, and they definitely have traditions of the time of the uprising against Rome. And, you know, the great Jewish families I told you about in Egypt, Philo of Alexandria, who Eusebius knows very, very well, and all his works influenced Paul and so on. And he speaks about his own mission to Gaius, Caligula, stop Caligula from putting a bust of himself in the temple. Josephus writes about that. The family of Philo in Alexandria were called the Alabarchs of Alexandria. And they were rich because they dominated the Red Sea trade. They dominated the Red Sea trade that went all the way to India. So there was already going on back in Roman times with Jewish families in Alexandria. And Philo's family is, one of Philo's nephews was Titus's military adjutant in the siege of the temple and the destruction of the temple. His name was Tiberius Alexander. His father was called Alexander. He was Philo's brother. So these are all interesting things. So that community in India goes way back to certainly the destruction of the Second Temple period and so on. And so talking about how far back, again, these are all very interesting studies to pursue. I only have one lifetime, so I don't need to do some. Going back to the Eastern European Pale of Settlement. Why was it called a pale? I don't think anyone ever knows. I don't know when it started to be called a pale. This area of no man's land in between the West and Russia, let us say. The Russian place was pretty well established at the time of, 1600s. They were, Kiev and these places were already resisting Mongols and Tartars and German knights and so on and so forth. You know, the Teutonic knights that Hitler thought he was imitating would already have fought this great Russian hero. They made a movie about Alexander Nevsky in the 17th century. So they were already, so it was somewhere squeezed in between those areas that this thing developed. I think it comes from the word Hebrew to work. And in fact, in the Zionist thing, the parties were all called Peolei, Workers' Party, the Peolei Zion, the Workers of Zion. I think this comes from this, where they were allowed to work. I think that's where the word pale comes from, the Hebrew word pa'al, to work, to act, to do. And I'm sure that that's where it comes from. We now say pale, and nobody knows where it's from, but I think it comes from that. Okay, so I want to just, before the break here, just read quickly. I want to just look at this one excerpt that we have here, not from Mendelssohn, but I want to look at this fellow, I hope I have, this fellow, Solomon Maimon. He gives a good picture of what it was like to come west as a kind of Schutzjude. I told you that Mendelssohn was a Schutzjude, that is a permitted Jew, who came west to be a tutor of some rich, I think, Berlin family's children or daughters or whatever. Huh?
Boys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Solomon Maimon was a Polish Jew who had studied Talmud and things like that. You find the excerpt here in this Jewish book here, history here, in page 34 onward. And he published an autobiography, and here he gives some excerpts from it. And I'd just like to read you this a little bit here if I can, although it may be too long. It looks like it is too long. But I'll read a bit. My return to Hamburg was agreeable, but here I fell in circumstances of the deepest distress. I lodged in a miserable house, had nothing to eat, did not know what to do. I had grown too enlightened to return to Poland, to spend my life in misery without rational occupation or society, and to sink back in the darkness of superstition and ignorance, from which I had hardly delivered myself with so much labor. He was one of these Jews who began to cultivate Western culture. On the other hand, I could not count on success in Germany owing to my ignorance of the language, as well as the manners and customs of the people, to which I had never yet been able to adapt myself properly. I had learned no particular profession. I had not distinguished myself in any special science. I was not a master of any language which could make myself perfectly intelligible. It occurred to me, therefore, that for me there was no alternative left but to embrace the Christian religion and get myself baptized in Hamburg. But even there, he was not, he tried to do it, I think. He says, I am a native of Poland, he wrote this letter, belonging to the Jewish nation, destined by my education to be a rabbi. But in the thickest darkness, I have perceived some light. And I guess he writes this letter to try to convert to Christianity. So that's a really interesting description there. And the pastor, I think, who he sends it to on page 36 says to him, you are too much of a philosopher, the pastor said, to be able to become a Christian. Reason has taken the upper hand with you, and faith must accommodate itself to reason. You hold the mysteries of the Christian religion to be mere fables, and its commands to be mere laws of reason. For the present, I cannot be satisfied with your confession of faith. You should therefore pray to God that he may enlighten you with his grace and endow you with the spirit of true Christianity, and then you can come back to me. If that's the case, I said to the pastor, I must confess that I am not qualified for Christianity, whatever light I might receive. So this is a really interesting little autobiographical incident. And he goes on about his life in Germany, ups and downs, I guess. Here on page 38, there's an actual description of a meeting with Mendelssohn. On my arrival in Berlin, I called upon Mendelssohn, as well as other old friends, and asked them, as I had now acquired some knowledge of languages, to employ me in some occupation. They hit upon the suggestion that in order to enlighten the Polish Jews still living in darkness, I should prepare in Hebrew, as the only language intelligible to them, some scientific works, which these philanthropists would then print at their own expense and distribute among the people. The proposal I accepted with alacrity, but now the question arose, what sort of work should a beginning be made? On this point, my excellent friends were divided in their opinions. One thought that the history of the Jewish nation would be the most serviceable for such purposes, inasmuch as the people would discover in it the origin of their religious doctrines and of the subsequent corruption which they had undergone. They would come to understand the fall of the Jewish state, as well as the subsequent persecution and oppression which the Jews had suffered, had arisen from their own ignorance and in opposition to all rational planning. According to this gentleman, recommend I translate someone's history of the Jews from French. This specimen gave satisfaction to all, even to Mendelssohn. I was ready to take the work in hand. But one of our friends thought we ought to begin with something on natural religion and rational morality, inasmuch as this is the object of all enlightenment. Accordingly, he recommended for that purpose I translate the natural religion of Reimarus. You guys probably haven't even read or heard of that work. But you see, they were in the grips of this new age in Europe. I'll go back to it in a second. This, what we call the Age of Enlightenment. The Enlightened Age, the 16 and 1700s, when Europe itself supposedly was undergoing an enlightenment. The bottom of 39, he goes on, once again I fell out with my friends in Berlin. In this dispute, Mendelssohn remained neutral because he thought that both parties had right on their side. Again, you'll have to read the excerpt yourself if you want to read it deeper to find out what the argument was really about. So I became impatient and resolved to quit Berlin once more and go to Breslau, which is further east towards Poland in Germany. I took with me some letters of introduction, but they were of little service. And so on. Irritated by my disheartening situation, I resolved to form the acquaintance of Christian scholars, by whose recommendation I thought I might find a hearing among the wealthy men of my own people. And so he describes how that went. Then he finally ends up on 41. At last, my situation in Breslau also grew precarious. And he explains to some extent why. So he returns to Berlin. I'm just skipping through here. When I came to Berlin, Mendelssohn was no longer alive, and my former friends were determined to know nothing more of me. So you see, for them to get along in these places, they needed someone always to help them. They needed someone to vouch for them, to protect them. I had now resolved to study Kant, 42's Critique of Pure Reason, of which I had often heard, but which I had never seen. The method by which I studied this work was quite peculiar. Such is properly the process which is called thinking oneself into a system. But as I'd already mastered Spinoza, Hume, Leibniz, and so on, I was naturally led to think a system that would synthesize them all. And so I thought I found this in the Critique of Pure Reason and so on. So he starts studying Kant, and now you and I probably haven't even studied Kant to the extent that would be sufficient for this period here. Finally, bottom of 43, I'm skipping through here, just to give you the feel for this. A number of young Jews from all parts of Germany had united during Mendelssohn's lifetime to form a society under the designation Society for Research into the Hebrew Language. They correctly observed that evil condition of our people, morally as well as politically, had its source in their religious prejudices, in their want of rational exposition of the Holy Scriptures. Accordingly, the object of their society was to remove these deficiencies, to study the Hebrew language sources, and by that means to introduce rational exposition. For these purposes, they resolved to publish a monthly in Hebrew under the title Ha'ma'asef, the Collector, which was to present the expositions of difficult passages in Scripture, Hebrew poems, prose essays, translations from useful works, and the like. The intention of all this certainly was good, but that the end would scarcely be reached by any such means I saw from the beginning. I was too familiar with the principles of the rabbis and their style of thought to believe that such means would bring about change. So here's, even in Judaism, we have the problem, or they were facing the problem, of the rabbis versus the people who wanted to go forward to a more enlightened, liberal sort of approach to life. The Jewish people, aside from accidental modifications, is a perpetual aristocracy under the appearance of a theocracy. The learned men who form the nobility have for many centuries been able to maintain their position as the legislative body with so much authority among the common people that they can do with them whatever they please. Now that is a really key charge here that he makes. And after the break here, I'll take a break in a minute, I think we'll show that that is to a certain extent true. I'll talk to you a little bit about Spinoza. I have another collection of materials that has to do with the excommunication of Spinoza. I'll give you that after the break. Let's just finish his point here. Sometime after I received from this society, which now styled itself the Society for the Promotion of the Noble and the Good, a commission to write a Hebrew commentary on Maimonides. Now Maimonides is a great Jewish learned person of the time of the Crusades in Spain, and he moved to Egypt. He was Saladin's physician, and Richard the Lionhearted used him and so on, and he was an Aristotelian Jewish thinker, and you know, everyone always is in awe of Maimonides.
Best book title ever.
Huh?
Best book title ever.
Guide to the Perplexed. You like that one? It's basically an Aristotelian tract, but yeah, I don't know if it really gets you out of perplexion or perplexity. I had been an adherent of all philosophical systems in succession: peripatetic, by which he means Aristotelian, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, and so these guys are way ahead of all of us. We don't, most of us in this class probably don't even know what they're talking about, and few of us have even read these people, but it shows how much there is out there that would be useful to look into if you have some time at some point. At last I observed that all these systems contain something true and in certain respects equally useful. But as the difference of philosophical systems depend on the ideas which lie at their foundation in regard to the objects of nature, their properties and modifications which cannot, like the ideas of mathematics, be defined in the same way by all men a priori, I determined to publish for my own use as well as for the advantage of others a philosophical dictionary, blah, 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 blah. And that's the end, basically, so much with regard to the events which occurred in my life, etc., etc. Well, that's that description. Why did I read it? First of all, I know you don't all have it. Second of all, if I don't read it a bit with you, I know that you're not going to get deep into it yourself. And now, having read it, I assume that you might look into it and read the whole little passage yourself. And it gives you a good picture of a Jewish young man trying to make his way in Germany at the same time that Mendelssohn is in ascendancy there, and the end of the 1700s, the time of the American Revolution in America. Now Mendelssohn is being inspired by the same ideas that inspired the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence. He's reading the same books that they're reading. They're all reading people like Hobbes, the English philosopher of the 17th century following the Cromwell affair, Hume, and people on the continent like Rousseau, and then John Locke. All these are the thinkers of the Enlightenment. Rousseau is considered, of course, one of the outstanding voices of the Enlightenment. Spinoza is another Jewish offshoot of all of these people. And he's functioning in the 17th century in Amsterdam. Now, just to finish up this little section of what we got to talk about today, got into today, we talked a bit about the Jews in Spain. When the Jews in Spain, I told you we know where they went. When they were expelled from Spain, they either converted, which I don't think a lot did, some did, but a lot left. Now, some went to North Africa, Morocco, and places like Fez and other places there. But then they spread across North Africa to Egypt, but a lot went to Turkey and the Balkans, because the Ottoman Empire was very receptive to their coming for some reason. And so their language, which was a mixture of Latin and Hebrew, which became called by most people Ladino, after the Latin, the idea that it was Latin, began to dominate a lot of these cultures in the Balkans. There was actually ultimately almost a Jewish city in northern Greece in the wake of all this. Saloniki, Thessalonica. And the Jews there were actually the stevedores of the port and things. It was a city almost dominated or completely Jewish at one point in northern Greece, if you know where that is. And the whole of the Balkans, Yugoslavia, southern parts of Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, all these people were taken away in the Holocaust. Hitler didn't ask them if they were Sephardi or Ashkenazi. Hitler actually rounded up people in Rhodes and Corfu. Didn't tell them where they were going. Just get a suitcase, and they just went them right into the gas chambers. People in the camps who had been there for a while saw them coming, felt too much pity to tell them where they were going. I mean, it's just so atrocious. And then to hear these guys go around denying this kind of thing is so despicable that it's horrific. That's all that I can tell you. It is horrific, and if you haven't had to be involved in it, you're fortunate. But to know these things is beyond imagination. So when you hear other people complain about this, that, or other thing going on today, there's lesser and greater evils is what there are. It isn't simply a matter of good and bad. Nothing is usually very good, but there's lesser suffering and greater suffering. There's lesser evil than greater evil. And I don't think anything compares with what we're talking about. And I think that the Jews from these countries like Rhodes and Corfu and these islands were taken away and had no involvement in any of it, and were Sephardi. Anyway, their language was Ladino. They spoke this mixture, so the Sephardi culture dominated, but that doesn't mean there weren't indigenous Jews in North Africa, and Yemen certainly was not really a Spanish area, but we call them all Sephardis now. Even Jews from Baghdad are called Sephardis. It's after this domination of the language pattern by the language from Spain. But other Jews from Spain went to southern France. The essayist Montaigne, who's a very famous French essayist from southern France, he's of Morano background. Became a very famous French essayist. Convert to Christianity already, but still of background. Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England, he's from Spanish Jewish background. went to Amsterdam, Holland, and then was invited back into England. His father's people in the Cromwell period and so on. And then he was baptized ultimately by his father because he couldn't get ahead, and he had falling out with the synagogue in England. And then rose to become the Prime Minister of England, even though his name was Benjamin Disraeli, the Benjamin of Israel. You know, a lot of families in England are of Sephardi background, but they came through Holland. Why did they come through Holland? Spinoza is a case in point. A Morano family ended up in Holland because Spain at that time controlled Holland. I don't know if you've seen those old Spanish artworks where they have different battles where they by Velázquez, who shows the Spanish armies in the Netherlands. They were fighting the wars of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation there, and they had called in the Spanish king, who was considered the Holy Roman Emperor successor. I forget what his name, and he was a representative of the papacy, if you like, in Holland. And so a lot of the refugees fled into Holland from Spain in this period and set up trades there that they still follow in Holland today. Diamond cutting today is a Jewish trade in a city like Antwerp and Brussels, particularly Antwerp. And a lot of them, of course, were killed in the Holocaust. The Dutch Jews, we know all about the story of Anne Frank, and she's representative of a huge mass of people who were exterminated. But, you know, they thrived for a while, and then Disraeli would be one of those people. So I just want to show you, before you go for the break, since I took some time at the beginning, let me just, I'm not going to read you this, but there is an actual writ, I don't have it in the other book, we have the writ of excommunication against Baruch Spinoza by the Sephardi community of Amsterdam, which is July 27, 1656. I'll read it to you when we go back, but you can ask, why would the Sephardi community of Amsterdam be expelling someone like Spinoza? If you've never heard of him, Spinoza was really the most famous philosopher of his day, an extremely developed rationalist who was sort of functioning at the time of Hobbes and Rousseau, probably a little earlier than Rousseau. Like Hobbes and Locke owes a lot to these people. So Spinoza is someone who everyone harks back to. I'm not a great expert on Spinoza, but he was excommunicated by the Jewish community in Amsterdam, the Sephardi one. I don't think there was any other one there at the time, because he was thought to bring the community into disrepute by his rationalist attitudes and what he was about. All right, so we'll have a break till 20 of, and then we'll come back and we'll go till 9:30, 9:35.